At the time Carter takes office, the Israelis and the Egyptians had fought 4 wars in the previous 25 years. Egypt and the other Arab countries don't even recognize that Israel has a right to exist. So the stakes were immensely high. The only army that could actually destroy Israel was the Egyptian army. And Jimmy Carter took the Egyptian army off the table, and not a shot has been fired in the 40 years since. Everybody's a product of their own background, and from a very young age, Jimmy Carter had to learn a whole series of competencies that you need on the farm and real attention to detail. He was a great man of science and wanted to be in the nuclear Navy, and he had his interview with Admiral Rickover, and he asked Carter in the interview, "Where did you stand in your class at Annapolis? Did you do your best?" And Carter said, "Well, not always." And Rickover said, "Why not your best?" And he turned around and left. Ever since that day in 1952, every single day, Jimmy Carter gets up and does his absolute best. He never, ever, ever phones it in. After he came home from the Navy, he got himself elected to the Georgia State Senate. He says and does a number of things in appealing directly to racists, but it works, and he gets elected governor in 1970. Then on his very first day, in his inaugural address as governor, he says
that the time for racial discrimination is over.
He believed that what you did in an election campaign was separate from what you did when you actually became first governor and then president. You could say all kinds of things in the campaign to get there, but then once he became president, every day he got up and thought, what do I do that is right for the country, not right for me politically?
As long as I am president, the government of the United States will continue throughout the world to enhance human rights.
From the time that Zionists arrived in what was then called Palestine around the turn of the century, there had been violence between Jewish settlers and Arabs. They fought at the time of Israeli independence in 1948. They fought again in 1956, but the Egyptians were not really direct parties to that until 1967. The 67 war, which only lasted 6 days, was a total rout for Israel. And they conquered a huge amount of territory. The Sinai, which was many, many times larger than Israel proper. And this was an enormous blow to Egyptian sovereignty. They vowed revenge. And so on Yom Kippur, the highest holy day in the Jewish tradition in 1973, they launched a sneak attack on Israel to try to get back some of what they had lost. But it was basically a stalemate. Henry Kissinger, when he was Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford, he had something called shuttle diplomacy, where he would go from Damascus to Cairo to Jerusalem, and they did get tentative accords, but without a president, a full peace treaty really wasn't going to happen. And Carter recognized this, that it was either he got personally involved or it was unlikely that Israel and Egypt would go to the next stage and actually sign a peace treaty.
The Arab nations, the Israeli nation, has to agree on permanent and recognized borders where sovereignty is legal as mutually agreed.
Now, Egypt, they have a President Anwar Sadat who decides to do something very bold. And in 1977, the first year of the Carter presidency, he announces that he would go to Jerusalem, the Israeli capital, if he was invited. The Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, can't really say no to this gesture of peace. But once this happens, once Sadat takes this step, then Carter becomes fully engaged. There was all this talk after Sadat visits Jerusalem. How do we build on this? What do we do? And quite a number of months pass and nothing's happening. And so it's Rosalind Carter who's very, very involved in everything that her husband does, who says, well, why don't you invite them to Camp David? Like, get out of Washington, go someplace that is just away from all of the noise and see whether you can make some progress there. And so that's what Carter did.
Compromises will be mandatory.
Sadat and Begin were like oil and water. Anwar Sadat was a larger-than-life character, really charismatic. Begin was very legalistic and very, very focused on a lot of the details. And Carter discovered this on the first day of the Camp David conference because they were at each other. And so he realized he had to separate them, deal with one, then deal with the other, then the other, and the other. The deal almost falls apart several times. Back and forth over 13 days. At the very end, Begin can't sign. He's not going to do it, and they're preparing to leave. Carter's secretary had arranged to have Carter sign photographs to Begin's grandchildren. Carter brings the photographs to Begin, and when Begin looks at what Carter has written to his grandchildren, he breaks down. And Begin says, all right, one last try. And then they get to an agreement for further negotiations on what exactly the deal is going to be. And they go back to Washington, they have an announcement, and it's very, very dramatic. And Begin says this should be called the Jimmy Carter Conference. Without Carter, it never would have happened. And then between November and March, it falls apart. So then, when it looks like the whole deal is falling apart, Jimmy Carter goes to the region. At this point, his advisor said, well, it's one thing to go a few miles out into Maryland at Camp David. You're going to go to the region? Now talk about a risk. Jimmy Carter says, I'm going. And he goes first to Jerusalem and then to Cairo. Then they actually get to the final treaty. It is the most successful peace treaty since World War II. Jimmy Carter showed that presidential leadership is indispensable for the country and for the world.